Hello and welcome to On Geopolitics, this podcast from the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge with me, Suzanne Raine. And today I'm joined not by Ali Ansari, but by John Nilsson-Wright, who is head of the Japan Careers programme at the Centre for Geopolitics. And John has brought along a special guest, John Delury, who is a historian of China and an expert on US-China relations on the Korean Peninsula. And he is also visiting professor at the John Cabot University in Rome and is speaking to us directly from the rare books room of the American Academy in Rome. And the reason that John and John are with me today is because we feel that we've had an awful lot of conversations about the transatlantic alliance, what's happening to NATO, the deal in Ukraine. And there's been a lot less focus, certainly so far, on America's alliances in what we now call the Indo-Pacific, but which we might also call Northeast Asia. So the Koreas and Japan, and how those alliances play out with regard to the policy on China. So that is the start point. And I'm going to ask John Delury to introduce the topic, and then I'm doing a podcast with two people called John, and then the other John is going to take it away with the questions. So John, the special guest, you first.
Well, thank you so much. First, let me say I'm delighted to be with the two of you this morning and on the podcast. It's great what you guys are doing. You know, it's interesting to reflect from an Asia perspective. I think there's a great deal of relief right now across the region that we aren't talking about it so much. You know, there has been this intensive focus in this first period of Trump foreign policy part 2 on the transatlantic, on Russia, Ukraine, Europe, and now, of course, the UK with the visit there. And we will talk about it, I'm sure, in terms of Japan's early summit there at the White House. But in a way, that was the exception that has proven the rule of a focus away from Asia. And so the first point I would make is I think many leaders, for different reasons, are a bit relieved. In fact, a prominent South Korean figure recently asked if South Korea could be given a sort of hiatus period until it has a government intact, because the president has been impeached and they're in the middle of a huge political disruption and crisis. And so a prominent, almost kind of shadow foreign minister figure explicitly asked and said, could Trump please wait? Could the Trump administration please wait until we have our act together before they really start their foreign policy toward the Korean Peninsula? And quickly on China, for very different reasons, you know, I think that while Xi Jinping and the people around Xi are very anxiously watching what's going on, particularly in terms of the talks with Russia, still, there's an initial kind of relief that they were not hit with the tsunami of 60% tariffs, as Donald Trump had said on the campaign trail he was planning to do toward China. So that, I would say, is just the short version of the state of play. And maybe from there, we can move on to the deeper level of analysis of where this might all be going.
John, if I can sort of explore this question of the relief that you mentioned that's been felt in South Korea and also in Japan. It seems odd, doesn't it? Because Donald Trump, in terms of his personal biography, has always singled out, particularly Japan, as a country that, in his view, doesn't play by the rules, if rules really matter to Donald Trump. But the view he formed of Japan back in the 70s and 80s, of a country that was playing fast and loose with international trade conventions, meant that he was expected to hit Japan really hard with tariffs as part of this much more transactional approach. So the interesting question is, why hasn't he? Why hasn't he decided to embrace a much more transactional approach to both of these two key allies? You know, they both represent, if you like, the part of that architecture of the hub and spokes alliance system that's been in place since the beginning of the Cold War. And yet we haven't seen him threatening South Korea yet, and similarly with Japan. And of course, both of these countries, as you mentioned, are in rather perilous positions politically. They're both weak domestically. The impeachment scandal in South Korea, Ishida in Japan, prime minister there with a minority administration. You would think it would be very tempting for the new White House to get out in front and start doing things that would have put them on notice that they have to deliver, much as the European allies have been put on notice. So I wonder how you explain this apparent reticence.
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the off-the-shelf theories would be bandwidth. They just don't have enough bandwidth to do it all, but they're sort of breaking bandwidth rules as far as what we're seeing, certainly with domestic policy. But I would say maybe it finally reaches its limits with foreign policy. But this whole early Trump flood the zone thing is quite real. I mean, Americans are really overwhelmed with how much is happening. And so it would be odd if they are not capable of doing that on the foreign policy front in the way that they are proving capable domestically. Every question you try to ask John about Japan, I'm going to send right back to you eventually because you are the Japan expert. But I'll throw out two thoughts on the Japan side and then Korea, and then I want to hear from you. On Japan, two thoughts come to mind. One is that, China is the new Japan. I mean, I do this exercise with my students where I have them read stuff from the late 1980s, early 90s, classic works of international relations and this kind of thing. And you can literally often just scratch out Japan and write in China. And the same paragraph holds, in terms of these fears of this Asian giant. And as you say, Trump was very much a product of those. The 80s is kind of formative for Trump. But I think he has gotten to the point where, it's sunk into him that is a bit outdated and that he can make almost a substitution to think about China the way he used to think about Japan. And then the second one, but again, I'm very curious, your analysis here. I mean, it did appear that Shinzo Abe, the prime minister at the time, he worked very hard. He was one of the early practitioners of what we're seeing across the board now, which is the attempt to please Donald Trump and to placate him and to win him over with a personal relationship. And Abe was at his height then and had long enough with Trump. So we could be seeing some of the effect of that in terms of how Trump conceives of Japan. On the Korean side, do you want to jump in on Japan and then we can move to Korea, John? Because
I was just going to say, I think you're right. The Abe approach of psychological profiling of Trump, which we saw back in 2016, I think from the point of view of the Korea civil servants in the foreign ministry, there's a kind of legacy effect. They know that they need to invest. And Ishiba was very much on script when he had his summit in Washington. So I think part of that was good preparation. And the tangible evidence of that was, on key issues like defense spending, Japan doubled down on its existing commitment to substantially increase its defense expenditure by 2027. And also on this issue of trade, one of the big issues that was dominant was the question of Nippon Steel and the planned takeover over US Steel. The Japanese have, I think, smartly presented this as they will invest in the US steel market and they will therefore demonstrate that they're providing tangible economic gains to this transactional president. So I think part of that is a reflection of that commitment. But it may well be, as you say, a degree of bandwidth issues. And so I think the Japanese are breathing a sigh of relief, but they're not out of the woods yet. And of course, not alongside that, we had a very important meeting in the first week of the Trump administration between Mark Rubio and the foreign ministers of the Quad countries, so Japan, India, and Australia. So there is institutional continuity. And I think it's those existing structures. And of course, looming in the background, as you rightly point out, is this question of China. Japan is going to be an indispensable partner for the United States in reassuring Washington that they will take a robust position on the question of the China threat. And that's been telegraphed well in advance. So I think there is, if you like, that powerful geopolitical incentive. But I want to hear what you have to say on Korea, because that's where, if you like, all the political drama has been happening recently.
Yeah. And well, first I would say this sigh of relief, as I think I characterize it, as you said in Japan, the same, my sense, in South Korea. It's a very shallow sigh of relief. There is an expectation on both the right and the left in the discussion in Korea that it's not here yet, but it is coming. The pressure is coming, and they are getting ready for immense pressure in terms of the trade relationship. They're ready to be on the chopping block along with Canada and Mexico and of course China and whoever else in terms of trade imbalances, and would be preparing their packages, for how to offset that and defray that and convince Trump not to do it and to give them time and to bring their gifts to Washington. Of course, we saw in the first Trump administration, I was there in Seoul the whole time, there was immense pressure over not so much defense spending as the South Korean military contribution to the United States for its military presence. The United States holds one of its largest, it's the largest physical base. It's less troops total than in Japan, but in the ballpark of 30,000 US troops are in South Korea. And Trump put huge pressure on South Korea to, at that point, it was quintuple the payment from 1 billion a year to 5 billion a year. Now the expectation in South Korea is that Trump's going to ask for 10 billion a year.
That's unsustainable, no? I mean, obviously the financial bandwidth to come up with that sort of ask is just not there, is it?
Well, it may be, but at that point, and once South Korea starts to pay that level, it becomes extortionary. I mean, in the view of the South Korean public, you're really using the money to break any shred of an alliance relationship. So even if they could come up with the money in some kind of packaging and financing, it pretty much would destroy the alliance. The alliance exists in the minds of people as well. It's not just the boots on the ground, So a future South Korean president would then say, well, if you really are going to insist on 10 billion, how about you pull a division out of South Korea? Let's bring it down to 20,000 troops, and then you get into that kind of haggling. And we'd be watching really the unraveling of the relationship for as long as, say, Trump is in office. So that's, I think, what is at stake in the ask. But again, South Koreans are getting ready for that. They're getting ready for that pressure on the economic relationship and on the military relationship. The third thing I'd just throw in is the North Korea piece. And it's possible that this explains a bit of the delay, because I think it's a little curious. In fact, from a real Trumpian negotiating art of the deal perspective, you could imagine him going hard, tell his people, hit the South Koreans hard, because they don't even have a president right now, and we're not seeing that. It's possible that in the kind of special Korean case, there's a delay simply because they are more focused on North Korea, that is actually a big thing. I mean, Trump made that a huge thing in his first term. I can't imagine it will get close to that level of significance. And I mean, it was where Ukraine is basically now. But still, he loves that issue. He talked about it on the campaign trail. He loves the thing with Kim Jong-un. Those of us who watch this all assume, myself included, that he wants it. He wants another summit with the theatrics and all of that. And so there may be a degree to which the South Korea piece is secondary to that. And the team is focused on, okay, how are we going to work the Kim Jong-un thing into all this? And then we'll kind of get to South Korea in the context of a North Korea-centered approach to the peninsula.
And we've already seen, interestingly, on that front, members of the opposition Democratic Party sending out a flare, if you like. I mean, this idea that if you want to work with Donald Trump, if you're worried about geopolitical risk and off-the-wall initiatives, such as the possibility that Trump would contemplate again the idea of negotiation with North Korea, we've had this suggestion that, well, maybe it's time for Donald Trump to be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize again. Here, the great peacemaker can reconcile the two Koreas, bring peace in our time in Northeast Asia, and enjoy all the diplomatic and political kudos that would represent. So the Democrats seem to be positioning themselves as if they almost expect some of this to happen. And of course, the other issue, which may be complicating things, is that if this impeachment controversy, which is still rumbling on, we've had the meetings of the Constitutional Court, the 11th meeting just this week, I think on Tuesday, and now the expectation is that they will reach a decision sometime in mid-March. And if the runes are being read correctly, the suggestion is that they will uphold the National Assembly's decision on impeachment. Then we're into an election process, 60 days. And therefore, by my calculation, sometime in May, we may have a new president. And what are the odds that this will be a Democratic president? Maybe Lee Jae-myung, a controversial figure himself, but somebody who might be expected as the heir to a tradition in South Korean politics of progressive negotiation with the North to embrace this strategy. To what extent are those electoral considerations maybe also acting as a bit of a brake on the American administration in terms of not going in hard at this stage?
I'm going to interrupt for the lay listener to say one of the things that I think would be helpful is to understand on the American side, at the moment, who is doing the thinking about Japan and Korea and how that relates to the president's policy on China, if it does. Because John Nilsson-Wright, you said there are powerful geopolitical incentives. And while you've both been talking, I've been thinking the reason this is different to Europe is firstly because America feels kind of tied into an alliance to protect Europe, which is almost an encumbrance, whereas here, the relation to the sort of the needs are more complicated in both directions, because if America's priority is China, then actually it has these needs with Japan and Korea as well, that because they're there and America isn't there. So who is, I mean, I hate to say who is advising Trump, but John Delury, when you reply to John's question, some idea about this sort of chessboard thinking that America is obviously having to do differently in this area because it also has needs in a way that are straightforward and geographic rather than, kind of ethical and responsible, which are its needs in Europe. That's my extra question. But who is it? Who are the people in this?
Well, thanks, Suzanne. As if John's question wasn't hard enough, you've made it doubly so. But let me try. It's a great double set of questions there. And as far as the who, well, Suzanne, you make the broader point that to keep it as simple as we can, lurking behind the U.S. policy toward Japan and South Korea are China and North Korea. And let's not forget, Russia is also kind of wedged in there with the North Korea-Russia alliance, which has been the most shocking development, at least in a North Korean context, in the last few years. And there were just reports that, in fact, there are still North Korean troops, another 1,000 troops, according to South Korean intelligence, were sent, I believe it was earlier this month or in January. So that is an active military alliance. So there's a backdoor way in which Ukraine and all of that does directly affect Northeast Asia. But you make the key point that China's the real big one. And then again, for Trump, Trump keeps his own counsel on North Korea. That's the first point I would make. And we saw that very clearly in the first term. And that will be the case in the second term. So I don't think he's asking anyone's advice. He's going to tell them. He does have some seasoned sort of Korea hands at a slightly lower, not the cabinet level, one level lower than that, who were there in the first term and roughly know. And so once that train starts to leave the station, and I do anticipate it will, in terms of Trump starting to say, okay, I want my meeting with Kim. When are we going to have our hamburgers? There will be a group who are ready for that, but they will be more implementing what the boss tells them to do. China, I think, is different. There's a complicated cast of characters at the cabinet level and also at whatever we call the Elon Musk tier of influence. But there are a lot of folks with actually vying views about how to manage China. And the core cabinet foreign policy folks have pretty strong backgrounds as China hawks, including the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor. And they will be arguing in these meetings, is what I would anticipate. They're probably holding their fire a bit, but maybe kind of preparing for what they want to do. Also in defense, in DOD, which is right now fighting culture war and kind of cleaning house and getting new leadership and ready in positions of influence. But once that first phase is done, then I think they start to turn toward the big enemy and make their arguments in terms of defense and spending, et cetera, that it's about China. And then you'll have an even a more complicated debate on the economic side. So there's a large cast, I would say. And then I anticipate Trump will kind of be up there. All right, what do you say? What do you say? And then he'll pick, and we'll see that kind of decision making or leadership style. And I guess this leads to a point, if we now try to bring it back to the South Korea question. I think if any of that is right, if some percentage of that construct is correct, you again can see how South Korea, in Korea, you talk a lot about Korea passing, that Korea gets ignored. But here they would be happily passed over, that the big discussions going on for maybe a kind of phase two, very China focused, And secondarily, Trump's going to want to do his North Korea thing. And then South Korea, okay, how are they going to help us with these two pieces? But it's more, we figure that out first, and then we're going to kind of tell the South Koreans, here's what we want from you. So maybe they're holding off, rocking the boat and hitting South Korea really hard until they see who they're dealing with, who is the South Korean president. And they've kind of moved into the next phase of grand strategy, which does have a big China focus to it.
Yeah, and I would endorse everything you say, John. I think that's a very sort of clear exposition of where the administration is. And some of the, the tea leaf indicators of continuity, I think, are worth highlighting, aren't they? I mean, we've had public statements by Mark Rubio, the Secretary of State, emphasizing the importance of the alliance. We've had testimony by the Deputy Defense Secretary designate in Congress just, I think, a few days ago, making it clear that North Korea is seen as a threat, an unambiguous threat. Some of the language between the South Koreans and the United States recently is interesting, calling for the full denuclearization of North Korea. Not too surprising, given all the progress North Korea has made, but interestingly, framing it, and this might sound a little bit inside baseball-y, in terms of denuclearizing North Korea, not the Korean peninsula as a whole. And that raises the question of defense preparedness and defense assurance, as well as deterrence of North Korea. And one of the assurance issues, which has become, I think, a big issue in domestic South Korean politics, is the question of South Korea maybe acquiring some of its own nuclear capabilities, given those bigger, deeper existential questions about the reliability of the alliance, which itself, of course, would then have in turn knock-on effects on Japan and other countries. So I think the Trump administration, if it's mindful of that issue, has to tread warily, because more than 70% of South Koreans are on record as saying they would, in principle, embrace the idea of an independent nuclear deterrence. It's also, I think, striking that we've had even the suggestion that the new defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, might be planning a visit to South Korea. So the mood music seems to suggest that security is still uppermost in the minds of the thinking of American officials. But in all of this, I wonder to what extent the mercurial president, Donald Trump, needs to be insulated from the danger that he will see this as continuity with the Biden administration, because the big substantive agreement that came in August of, when was it, 2023, the Camp David agreement, which was this big step forward in alliance coordination, if you like, creating almost a virtual alliance between Washington, Tokyo, and Seoul. Quite unprecedented.
Tell us who don't know what that was, the Camp David agreement.
The Camp David agreement was an agreement signed by President Yoon, Prime Minister Kishida, and President Biden, designed to, if you like, institutionalize much more active defense and security cooperation between those two key American allies and the United States. And part of the reason it was agreed was because I think there was a genuine fear on the part of the Biden administration that if they were to lose the next election, that these ties could unravel. So it's an attempt to embed it in this much more robust set of trilateral patterns of coordination and cooperation. Some of that has happened, of course, bilaterally between Tokyo and Seoul, but the Americans have been front and center in encouraging that.
And what are the obligations that it brings?
Well, I'm going to pitch it back to John, actually, because
it's more a spirit.
Oh,
it's the Camp David spirit, right? Isn't that right, John? But as far as, no, this is a key point, I think, that you've made here. Secretary Rubio is probably most vulnerable to the charge of, wait a second, this looks like Biden. This whole wing of what we're doing, why is this on autopilot? And so, I mean, I track as we all do, the statements, and the statements, the kind of State Department language on Northeast Asia is on autopilot. It's the same stuff. You're not seeing, it's almost like it's inoculated for now from what else is going on. I'm just thinking there's a very funny way in which South Korea is quite lucky that their president had this crazy idea of declaring martial law and then has self-imploded his presidency, assuming, as 9 out of 10, I think Koreans do, whether they like it or not, assuming that the impeachment is upheld. And there is the snap election, as John described. And in around mid-May, we have a new South Korean president. I think we can assume most likely it's the opposition, the liberals of the Democratic Party. It's most likely Lee Jae-myung, their front runner. But even if it's a conservative in some wild twist, which South Korean politics is always capable of, still, Trump does not see this Yoon guy who's most famous for singing American Pie, the Don McLean, country rock anthem, with Joe Biden in the White House. So it gives South Korea sort of a clean slate as far as the personalistic, because there's the transactional aspect of Trump's foreign policy. There's also the very personalistic side of it, right? And so South Korea gets a shot at a new president. I mean, Lee Jae-myung, if we stick with him, we can get into it if you want, Suzanne.
Just give us a little pen picture of him so that we can imagine him.
All right. The real short version is he was narrowly defeated in the last South Korean election, which in South Korea means you get to run again and try it a second time. So he is the presumptive candidate from the Liberal Party, the Democratic Party. And he comes from kind of a working class background, up the bootstraps, tough mayor and governor. But then he also carries with him a lot of baggage, including legal cases against him for various and sundry, either it's kind of low-level corruption or deceitful behavior. And you start to get very polarized now into whether he's a good guy or bad guy and all this. So we can certainly say he's got a lot of baggage. But his supporters would say that's what we need, is not someone with baggage, but a tough guy who you could also say he's a populist. He's an economic populist. Now, as far as foreign policy, our focus, which would not win him the election, will be domestic issues. But if it's him, and again, if it's really anyone, they're going to do the same thing we're seeing European leaders and Ishiba. He's going to get on a plane, go to Washington or go to Mar-a-Lago or wherever he can go and do everything to win over Donald Trump. If, in particular, if it is an Lee Jae-myung, if it's someone from the liberal side, he's going to say, I know exactly what you want to do with North Korea. I share your sentiment about that. I can help you. We're Koreans. We speak the same language. The last guy didn't want to do this, but I do. I'm 120% behind your ideas. And this can be said with conviction by a liberal South Korean. So we'll work together on this. Let's make this the focal point. And then from there, we figure out how this works. Now, this can get really complicated, John, on the nuclear stuff, because as you pointed out, there's a lot of support in South Korea now. Public opinion has shifted toward, maybe we need our own. As far as if you do get Kim Jong-un back to the table and do get into negotiations, you can start with denuclearization and you can keep it in there in the mix as, well, ultimately we're trying to get there. But that is not on the table of any serious negotiation with the North Koreans, except in a decades-long timeline, basically. So there's a kind of 4D chess play here where they've first said, okay, the goal is denuclearization of North Korea. They get into negotiations and it's like, yeah, way down the road, we're going to get there. In the meantime, North Korea is going to do these good things to stop being threatening, and we're going to start to get along, and we're going to turn, Wonsan, the city on the East Coast, we're going to put a Trump hotel. And I mean, they talked about these things in the first term. We're going to transform the relationship. South Korea is going to transform it too. And by the way, South Korea is going to keep spending massively on defense. They're also going to start to maybe build up something that looks a little bit like a nuclear capability of their own as part of this global thing of you don't rely on America like you used to anymore. And we, America, are going to use our presence. And so there's this kind of a way in which actually these things come together, and a liberal South Korean leader could be fully on board with these.
And he needs to be on board, right? Because, I mean, one of the worries that both South Korea and Japan have had, you mentioned Korea passing, and the Japanese similarly talked about Japan passing in the 1990s. Their big worry is that Trump will make a deal over their heads. So getting in early, as you say, getting on a plane, going to Washington, if Lee Jae-myung is elected president, is so important to say, look, we are part of this deal. We need to be sitting around the table in any negotiation. And the temptation that Donald Trump, as we're seeing with the talks with Russia over Ukraine, and given that Russia and North Korea now have a new strategic partnership, agreed last autumn, is there a risk that we'll have a replay of that dynamic I think that because both for Japan and South Korea, obviously the China threat is the big fundamental threat in the region, but the North Korean issue is one that they both worry about.
Yeah, I think it's an apt analogy for sure. One difference is if you think of South Korea in a sort of fictitious Ukraine position and things being negotiated over its head, obviously there's no actual war or invasion, but also South Korea is Russia to North Korea's Ukraine in the sense of it is it's twice the size of population. The one thing North Korea has, which gets all the attention, is the nuclear program. But other than that, South Korea is, depending on your metric, 20 to 40 times the size economically, in terms of GDP. It's a global powerhouse in all these ways. And so South Koreans can have a degree of confidence in dealing with this stuff. Still, the point is absolutely right that they want to be right there, either in the room or the minute the Trump people get out, they will let the South Koreans know what the status of the negotiation is. As I think about this, what's really complicated for South Korea, and John, maybe you can talk, I'd be very curious on the Japan side, is, as you said, the China piece. Because here we get into, from a South Korean perspective, in my experience, South Koreans don't worry too much about China as a security threat. There's a new fear, but it's still on sort of the far right or alt-right of Chinese subversion. But that's quite new, and hopefully the South Korean politic can nip it in the bud, because most South Koreans have thick skin about, we're not worried about, China reaching inside of our democracy. Not so worried about China invading South Korea, or a war erupting in the Yellow Sea between South Korea and China. Americans think a lot more about a war with China over Taiwan, obviously. South Koreans are like, not sure what we do, but we're not directly involved in that. What South Koreans worry about is the economic relationship. They are massively exposed, and they are extremely vulnerable and paid a big price in the first round of US-China trade war, when both under Trump and as it continued under Biden, South Korean firms, South Korean capital is caught in the crossfire of that. And so in a way, the North Korea piece, I think, is much easier. I think, especially in Lee Jae-myung, if it's him, he would be delighted to be able to talk about North Korea and make that the focal point of his relationship with Trump. The problem is going to be managing, once we see what the actual approach to China is on the security and the economic side, the South Koreans are going to have a very hard time managing that. And they also don't have much leverage. I mean, they're barely invited in the room. They more have to deal with, that's what happened in the first round. Again, under Biden as well. The South Koreans were extremely frustrated because they were getting caught oftentimes in friendly fire with Biden's industrial policy to compete against China was hurting South Korean firms badly. And it took them a year to get any response from the administration and from Congress. And so that's where it's really hard for South Korea.
And there's also that kind of powerful residue of economic nationalism in South Korea.
For sure.
Right, which you can see on both the left and the right of the political system. There's been a history of antagonism between the US and Korea on issues which sort of resonate at a street level. So if it looks as if they're being coerced or squeezed on the economic front, and this, of course, provides, in theory, I suppose, an opportunity for China. Lee Jae-myung himself, as a candidate in the last presidential contest, said dramatic things like, well, why should we worry about Taiwan? This isn't really our issue. And you can imagine Donald Trump picking up that question, if it comes across his desk at some point and saying, well, logically, South Korea should be backing us on our broader security issues, including on Taiwan. So it's not just a division of labor, with South Korea focusing on the North Korean challenge and Japan focusing on China along with the United States and other actors. I mean, there's another opportunity here, of course, which, to come back to your point about Japan and Japan's view of China, it's the same sort of non-zero-sum choice, right? In the sense that there's significant economic dependence for the Japanese on the Chinese market, just as there is in South Korea. There's a recognition that you need, however cold the security and strategic relationship becomes because of disputes over Taiwan or other territorial issues, you still need a warm, positive economic relationship. And we've seen some of that come to the fore with discussion of putting greater emphasis on trilateral economic coordination between Seoul, Tokyo and Beijing. How does that fit into this larger model? How do you balance that relationship with the United States, which under Donald Trump may be simply expecting and demanding that its allies, subordinate allies, take sides on both economic and security issues?
Well, that's very interesting because, again, if we get into Korea, the Korea-Japan piece, some of your listeners will know, but others might not appreciate just how complicated that relationship is. And the fact that this aforementioned, Camp David Accord, or not Accord, the spirit of Camp David, and the work that the Biden administration did, bringing Japan, Tokyo, and Seoul together, that has not received a huge buy-in from the Korean public. I mean, Koreans remain quite wary. I think we're supportive of the degree to which it's moving along, but there's deep skepticism toward Japan, to put it mildly, in the Korean public. And there's not been a kind of healing and bringing back together of those publics. And so all of that, all the work that the Biden administration did was built on a very thin, and frail kind of foundation. And I should add that your typical South Korean conservative may feel one way inside, but they'll suck it up or they'll be genuinely happy and say, yes, we got to improve relations with Korea. And this is great. US, Korea, Japan, onward we go. Your typical South Korean liberal is very skeptical of Japan, also kind of skeptical of the United States, and not at all too enthused about this trilateralism. Okay. This same South Korean liberal, which may occupy the presidency yet, if you say to them, well, how about a China, Japan, Korea trilateral? They'll say, well, that sounds interesting. And it's much more comfortable. It's focused on economics. There's no security dimension to this at all. It gives Korea a bit of leverage here because now Korea's in the room with the big dogs. The United States is not there. The Trump administration doesn't really like this stuff, but that's the point. It's kind of to give Japan and South Korea a little bit of leverage where they're having their own discussions and negotiations with China and figure things out. China loves it because, of course, it's prying away the two key U.S. allies in the region. And so I'll have to ask you, John, how this goes down in Japan. But with a liberal presidency in South Korea, that's a very appealing. And of course, they already have some of those structures, right? It's a question of how significant those meetings really are. But South Korea would simultaneously, a liberal South Korean would be pushing hard. I'm going to go to Mar-a-Lago and we're going to do this big North Korea thing to bring peace to the peninsula and nominate Trump for a Nobel Prize. Simultaneously, I'm going to go to Beijing, and that'd be great if Japan shows up. And we're going to talk about economic coordination in the region. That makes perfect sense to a South Korean liberal leader.
Yeah. I mean, all of this comes down, I think, to, well, two things, doesn't it? Personalities and public sentiment. Because, we talk about this kind of set of strategic choices as if it's a kind of rational set of calculations. And one of the things that seems self-evident now, when we look at the recent election we saw in the United States, the impeachment, the energy behind the impeachment controversy in South Korea, and the sort of volatility that we're seeing in Japanese politics, is that those sort of rational calculations aren't cutting through at the level of electoral politics. In fact, quite the opposite. Individual politicians are able to exploit this. Lee Jae-myung, who you mentioned, of course, has kind of played the sort of Japan card, the big historical emotional issues, when it comes to running for election. Would he be able to sort of step back from that if he were president and to govern and to make those coherent choices? Would the Japanese themselves be willing to play ball? Because I think one of the things that's, for me, always very striking is how much now these days impatience there is in Tokyo when it comes to thinking about Korea. A sort of baked in type of fatigue about how best to deal with the bilateral relationship because they've seen it derailed so many times in the past. And I think that's the sort of the dangerous, if you like, political kindling that could get out of control if there's an emotional issue that could be exploited. So I'm not sure. But I think, yes, if the sort of people around Lee Jae-myung, the man you mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, right, Lee Sung-lak, who has been calling for this pause to give South Korea and its political players time to regroup. If this political pause is not there, then I think there's a danger that we could see some of these issues coming back in the election in ways that really complicate the relationship. I want, however, to sort of pivot back to you and ask you one sort of last sort of concluding thought, really, John, if you can address it. In all of this, how does Xi Jinping make an assessment when it comes to Northeast Asia and these two key players, these two key allies of the United States? Because Kevin Rudd has just come out with this new interesting book in which he basically argues that Marxist-Leninism is back with a vengeance. Xi Jinping's foreign policy is moving rightwards. It's becoming more nationalistic. At the same time, his economic policy and his control over the political environment in China is increasingly dominated by the sort of more left-wing, Leninist, ideologically defined policies. And all of this is wrapped around this idea of a new order which China is going to lead and export to the world. Isn't this, with Donald Trump giving up on the old Bretton Woods liberal order, a prime opportunity for China now to try and do something big ideologically? And in that context, can it peel away countries like South Korea, perhaps less plausibly Japan? But I'd be really interested to know how you think, from Xi's perspective, all of this looks.
Well, I'll give you the very short version. I'll have to write a book to go next to Kevin Rudd to give the full answer. But I wouldn't agree with the assessment of, for example, Marxism, Leninism. I mean, it helps a little bit. It's one piece. But to me, that is not the key that unlocks the secrets of Xi Jinping's, thinking and strategy. He does have a strong ideological element, but I would look for him, as I think he has been, unveiling that and continue to. And I agree with the premise of your question. What Trump is doing now and is likely to continue to do is a huge opportunity for Xi and for China to push now another level of their vision, because many people think, certainly here in Europe, that we are watching the unraveling, the implosion of the post-1945 sort of order, or the post-Cold War order, and that is inherently an opportunity for China. So I agree with that premise, but I don't think it has to do with Marxism, Leninism. I also don't think that, I think Xi is smart enough to know that his immediate neighborhood, especially South Korea and Japan, is maybe the worst place to roll it out, because they know too much. They understand way too much about the language and the ideology. They've dealt with China for so long, so intensively, that they will see through a lot of things. I would look more toward at a global level, but in the global South, in Africa, Latin America, other parts of Asia. Interestingly, maybe I think we could see some efforts in Europe, which in its way doesn't really understand China, certainly to the degree that Koreans and Japanese understand it. So I would look for what you're talking about, but on a global scale, less focused on the immediate region. But I think that is absolutely something for us to keep our eyes on in the months and years to come.
Thank you very much, both of you, John and John. This has been an education for me, and actually very thought-provoking, because you were talking about a sort of complicated chess game, which it certainly feels like. And then at times I think it feels a bit more like being in a washing machine, and everything is just swirling around. And there's some fabulous pointers for us to think about and look for in the next couple of months. So John Delury, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
John Nilsson-Wright, thank you for being there continuously.
Thank you.
And that's goodbye from me.